On today's show, we talk with Darrel Coulter, and we talk about the numerous of different conversations we need to have with pitchers to get them to understand how to pitch.
Welcome to another episode of the Baseball Awakening Podcast, where we dive into the raw, unfiltered, unsexy side of player development. Get ready for some knowledge bombs with your host, Geoff Rottmayer.
Welcome to the Baseball Awakening Podcast. I'm Geoff Rottmayer, and today we sit here with Darrel Coulter of STARTTPitching.com. Again, that's STARTTPitching.com. Darrel, the pitching strategist, working with many professional and college guys to develop strategy to help them become the best version of themselves. Darrel, I'm excited to have you here, man. How are you?
Doing great, Geoff, man. I'm excited to be on the Baseball Awakening podcast, and I'm looking forward to our conversation today, man. Every time you and I get together, we have some super deep baseball conversations, and I always learn something. So I'm excited to share with your audience today, and let's get this going.
Yeah, I agree. We do get deep, and man, I learn a lot as well. So, look, you and I, we talk a lot, and what we talk about is there are guys that teach throwing, and then there are guys that teach pitching, getting guys out. And to me, you're a pitching coach. But if we had to go by the industry standard, if there is such a thing, you would be classified as an approach guy or even a mental guy. How do you define what you do?
Oh, that's a great question. I think a couple things. One is I try to look at baseball almost kind of deconstructing what it would take to become a major league pitcher. And again, with a lot of my pro clients, I don't even want them to look at it what it takes to get to the big leagues. I want them to look at it from the perspective of what's it going to take to have a 10-year major league career. So it's not just about getting to the big leagues or what it's going to take to get to the big leagues, but it's really about how do we redefine what it takes, and then how do we really super individualize that. And so I take a different approach. The last 13 years, I've really started studying why first, second, third round picks don't consistently make it to the big leagues. And so through a couple studies that I went through from Simpson and Karcher, that went back and basically studied the percentage of first round, second round, third round, and basically the whole draft from like 1960s on. And what's ironic about this is over the last 15, 60 years of the draft, the percentage of players that's drafted by round that make it to the big leagues is almost exactly the same. And so with all the advances that we have in baseball training and all the medical research that's done on arm injuries, and again, there's some fantastic guys out there doing some awesome stuff. But when I sat down and started going through and interviewing these pitchers and really digging deep into why they thought they didn't have more success than they did when they were projected as the top players in that year's draft, it was an interesting conversation and dynamic that kind of came out of that. A lot of the times they thought it was a physical thing, but yet they couldn't put their finger on it. And so when we started going through this and started having a little deeper conversation, and we're baseball guys, I did the same thing. I got drafted out of high school. I played 4 years in the minor leagues, and honestly, it was a good experience, but there was some huge regrets that I had coming away from it. And being a small town guy that just never really had that kind of baseball knowledge around me, it was one of those things that you just learn by playing. You just learn by going out there and competing in the backyard or on the playground, and then eventually into summer ball or high school ball. But what happens is that there's a little piece of this that I tell these guys all the time, that it took me about 5 years after I got done playing that I finally realized that there's more to it than what I call the prerequisites or the scout skills. But yet there's such a huge emphasis at an early age to develop these physical skills, to develop the velocity, to develop mechanics, that we've missed this huge part of it, which is at the end of the day, baseball, and especially pitching, is about getting hitters out. And so what we tried to break this down to is how we really figure out how these pitchers choose what pitch they're going to throw. And so when I started breaking that question down to them, and I really started digging deeper into the psychology or the mindset on why these pitchers chose the pitches they were choosing, then we had a totally different conversation about baseball. And that was kind of my aha moment right then, that we've always, as coaches, we got this tendency to want to label things. We want to go back through and identify why we think things are happening, because we're used to managing teams, or we're used to trying to manage pitching staffs. So we're trying to come up with these ways, these drills, these skill development things that we do to try to sit here and kind of mass produce pitchers. But what I've taken away from all this research and these conversations and working with all these guys that were, at the top of the drafts, was at the end of the day, it came down to that they got released out of pro ball because of what I called the indecision problem. And when we started really digging deep into what the issue really was, it was the choices they were making when they were standing on the rubber. It wasn't a matter of physical capability. These guys were the most physically capable players in the world. They were, a lot of them threw 94, 95, 96 miles an hour. So it wasn't a mechanics issue. It was an indecision issue. And so whenever we start talking about the mental game, or we start talking about the psychology piece of it, then it kind of scares people off, because from a scout's perspective, the way we graded these kids out is that, hey, we think he's mentally tough, or we give them kind of these surface level projections or projectability that we try to gauge their pitches and their mindset and the intangibles. Again, it's just a series of labels that we've given these kids. But at the end of the day, it always came down to their inability to effectively choose the right pitch to throw. And so when I took that approach with it, Geoff, it kind of changed the way we do it. So I try to, again, to give you the quick answer for a long, drawn out question, is that it was about how we choose the pitch. And so I would define my job as a pitching strategist. I try to really take it past the prerequisite, past the scout skills, into a series that I call the strategic pitching process, which is I break it down into 4 different areas, which is the idea assessment. I really want to get to know this pitcher on an individual basis. What is their intellectual interest? So the idea is an acronym for intellectual interest, desire, their emotional connection or investment in wanting to be a pitcher, and then do I think it's authentic? And that's where I start all these conversations at. And so that is my number one basis on whether I choose to work with a client or not. They got to be intellectually interested in playing baseball, and especially pitching. And then what is their personal desires? What do they want to take away from the game? What are they hoping to get out of baseball itself, big picture, purpose-wise? And then what is their emotional connection? Why do they really play? And not just because they're good, or not because God gave them some athletic ability. I want to know really, why do they play? And so once we get to that piece of it, now we get a chance to build that relationship with this player. And that's why a lot of the consulting I do is not scalable, because it's a one-on-one business, and it's really getting these guys to open up and take it to a deeper level and really start to really focus on how they choose what pitch they throw. And that's where we kind of start the process. So I kind of, again, man, I try to give these guys the big picture view of what a 10-year major league career would look like. And then we kind of deconstruct the process all the way to the mound to how they decide what pitch they're going to throw.
Yeah, that's awesome. And you and I talk about that quite a bit. And I agree with you that this is kind of the missing link. And I think, and based on the conversation that you have with these guys, how much of this is due to the way they were coached growing up, not being able to make the decision that they need to be able to make, and not being able to do the trial and error to figure out who they are?
Well, I think it's a couple of things. I don't like blaming coaches or different things. I think people grow up and they are what they are, and they learn what they learn. I think what happens at the end of the day, the emphasis of the coach and what they think is important, whether it's a philosophical interest or whether it's a strength and conditioning or a throwing program, whenever we take a label and we try to get all these kids to fit within that philosophy, then it creates almost this filter. The kids that fit into it naturally stand out. The ones that don't, then they feel like there's something missing all the time. And so what's happened is with these kids that have some athletic ability, or the kids that have some talent at a young age, some physical capabilities, then we start labeling them, and then we start putting them into some kind of training program or some kind of training process. And what happens then is the emphasis, while that kid's 13, 14, 15, 16, 17 years old, is more into physical development. And then they're in this constant state of convince and compare. So they're always trying to convince a coach or a college coach or a recruiter or whoever it is that they're physically talented enough, and they're in this constant state of comparing themselves against every other player that they see play. And so what happens is it creates this mindset that pitching is really about, okay, do I do the things that get the recruiters and the scouts' attention? And then how do I compare to everybody else? And within that mindset is where the trap happens, because that mindset is what permeates all the way up through the minor leagues and is the single greatest problem I see in baseball with minor league players. It's not physical capability. Again, these guys are the most physical, talented players that we have available to play in the minor leagues, or at least we hope they are based on what the scouts' opinions of them were. But what happens is when you're trapped in that convince and compare mindset, you never convert over into how do I individually get hitters out. And so the hardest thing I have to do with these pro guys that are so physically talented is try to convince them that, hey, you got the physical capability. You have the ability to execute these pitches, these two-seam sinkers, or this slider, or this nasty curveball. But the real deal is how do you learn how to read and study hitters, and then how do you learn when to throw what pitch in what situation and count, and that happen in real time against the best hitters in the world. And see, now that takes a mindset shift, Jeff. That means we have to go from this convince and compare mindset into what I tell these pro guys, that you've got to have this mindset shift if you're going to pitch in the big leagues. You got to go from this convince and compare into what I call this compete and contribute mindset. That now you finally feel like I'm physically capable. I got the pitches. Now it's a matter of how do I compete against every hitter? How do I decide what pitch I'm going to throw? And then how do I contribute to my team, whether it's a AA, AAA, or the major league team? And so when we start talking about deeper conversations about what it really takes to get to the big leagues, the truth is most of these major league decision makers are trying to figure out some way to get a sense on not whether you're physically capable of pitching in the big leagues. That's the easiest thing to identify while you're in the minor leagues. The hardest thing to identify is whether these guys intellectually can adjust to major league hitters who are studying them. Kind of the sophomore slump thing that I call it. You know, you have the sophomore slump. Once the league gets to see you once or twice, how do you intellectually adjust? And then the emotional stuff. How do you handle that emotional, the adjustment of pitching in that environment? How do you respond to the pressure? How do you respond to the things? Some of those things you don't ever get to realize until you actually experience that environment. But what you can see and what they try to sense is, do they have this kind of, I call it situational count awareness, that it's just this moment that they see and they understand when they're standing on that rubber getting a sign from the catcher, that they sense the situation and count, and it helps them decide intellectually and emotionally and mentally to physically be able to execute the absolute best pitch to throw in that situation and count. And that's deep, man. I get it. But that's the heart and soul of why we need to learn how to read and study hitters and master our pitches. But as long as we're in that convince and compare mindset, we never do get to the point of mastery, because we're always thinking there's something missing or there's more I need to do. And, man, that's a hard conversation with these guys that already throw 94, 95 miles an hour. And for somehow they think that my physical capability is going to magically somehow turn into this strategic process, and I'm going to learn how to honestly throw my pitches. by velocity and movement to a specific location on purpose. And see, that's the shift that's got to happen, Geoff. That's the hardest part. When I talk about trying to convince these guys that they have the physical talent already, and now we got to move deeper than that. That's the hardest piece to convince them of, because all of the positive things that happened to them up to that point has been based on their physical capability. And from the time they were 12, 13, 14 years old and showed this little spark of having the athletic talent to do it, then that's what's been pushed. They've been going to the best pitching coaches, or they've been buying the best strength and conditioning programs they could get. And a lot of this time, it's not information that's missing. It's honestly, how do you get hitters out?
Yeah, I agree. And let me ask you, Darrell, you talk about the intellectual interest and the personal interest and the emotional interest. So when you're sitting there and you're talking with the guy, how deep does this conversation have to go for you to say, yep, we checked the box of intellectual interest, he personally interested, and then he has the emotional interest. How deep does this conversation have to go for you to say, yep, he checked the box and all the marks, and he has a chance?
That's an awesome question. Here's what it's not. It's not an IQ question. This ain't about how they will do on their ACT, SAT. That's what college coaches need for you to get in school. That's not what I'm looking for. What I'm looking for is, can they tell me, you know what, when we start asking them when they started baseball, how old were they when they started pitching? And you can tell the way they talk to you, the way they explain it to you, whether it's something that they were just forced to do, or my dad made me do it, or my uncle thought I was a good player, so he kind of took me here, which is all good ways to start. But when I take them back to the beginning and we start having real conversations about, when did you start pitching? How did it feel, man? What did you think about it? What excited you about playing the position of pitcher? And then we start going into, and I ask them, man, what up to this point, what's been your best baseball experience? And then I ask them, what's been your worst baseball experience? And I ask them those two questions because it will tell me where they're currently at, and it will give me some kind of gauge on what they really feel. That when they're in this circumstance, here's what's happened. When a coach pushes this button, here's how they're going to emotionally react. And so when we get to that point, man, it just gives me a deeper insight of whether these guys are really playing for them, or what is their interest honestly in playing. If it's somebody that constantly talks about velocity or talks about their physical skills and talent, then I know right then that if they have the ability to get drafted or even go to a D1 school, that when they get into that environment with other kids that are just as good as them or better than them, they're going to struggle. Because what they thought to the physical skills and ability, the scout skills, I call it, that it took them to get to that level is not what makes you a great pitcher at the D1 level or in the pro ball. I mean, we got to start getting guys out. You know, we can project these guys all day long, but when they turn 20, 21, if they ain't getting guys out, then guess what? We got a deeper problem than physical capability. They truly don't understand it. And that's why, again, man, I know this is step on some of these guys' toes, Geoff, but that's why I will not recommend any of my guys to go to a college that the coach calls the pitches. And so I've had some sensitive conversations with some good coaches about this, and again, I get it from the perspective of that it's their job and it's all the business piece of it is them, but from an individual pitcher development, that if that kid ain't out there and he ain't intellectually deciding why he's throwing the pitch, the absolute best pitch to throw in this situation and count, then one, he's not emotionally attached to the outcome, which I don't try to keep my pitchers emotionally neutral. I try to keep my pitchers emotionally connected and invested, which is different. See, one thing is I'm trying to calm this guy down. No, pitching, every decision we make is an emotional decision. Every decision, I don't care what part of life it is, we make a decision based on past experiences, and then we label it. So when I'm teaching these guys pitch command, and when I call mastery, what I want these guys to do is I want them to literally see that pitch in their mind, feel that pitch in their fingertips, then execute the pitch. That's the 3 steps that I want them to see. But to be able to get them to see that, it has to start with an image and a pattern and an experience. That's why we throw bullpens. That's why we practice. That's why we have the fundamentals. Is so we create this image and this pattern and experience of a baseline on how it ought to be done. But once we get physically developed and once we get physically mature and we get into college and into pro ball where these guys are now men, we got to start basing our decisions on not whether we're physically capable of, but what pitches have I mastered? What do I know about this hitter that I'm pitching against? And then right now in this situation account, what is the best pitch that I could throw by velocity and movement to a location that I have mastered? And that's why pitching is so emotionally draining. The truth is that the decisions that these pitchers have to make every pitch is what drains them. And if they're doing it right, they're doing it based on the preparation before the game, what they're reading and studying about the hitter and the umpire during the game, and then what they trust, what they know, these pitches that they can master. When we sync those together, Geoff, that's where we have the most confident pitchers ever. Right then, when we have the intellectual, the emotional, the mental, and the physical all synced together. And so with my consulting piece, that's what I go through with these guys. The strategic pitching framework that I use with these guys is based on a mindset shift. It's based on mastering your pitches, reading and studying hitters, and game day strategy. And so that's what I do with most of my pro and college clients, getting them ready to play at the next level. Because when a major league decision maker that's going to have any kind of impact on whether you ever pitch in the big leagues, when you sit down with them and they start asking you questions, you know what I want you to do? I want my guys to give them the intellectual interest answers, not the, hey, I throw 94, I do this and this, the same cookie cutter answers they're going to get everybody. I want them to blow these guys away with, not only am I intellectually interested, but you know what? I know that your job depends on how I pitch too. And it's kind of that maturity, kind of that respect, and it does. It just, and that alone, Geoff, could be the differentiator between get from AAA to the big leagues and from the big leagues to having a 10-year career. And a lot of it is relationships. A lot of it is not physical talent, man. It's relationships and being able to communicate and really, really dig deeper into the business aspects of baseball too, brother.
Right. So let's go back to the conversation of the intellectual, personal, and emotional. So you have a guy, and
yeah.
And I'm sure you've had plenty of this, but he is playing because he's good and his dad wants him to. And that kind of starts to lead the natural progression of, hey, I'm pretty good, so I might as well just pursue it. But we know that the end result, this guy's probably not going to be emotionally invested enough to get to the big prize. And maybe it's not his big prize. So how does that conversation go?
Well, you know what? Usually, Geoff, I tell them that. After I get done with the idea assessment, I just tell them. And I don't say it mean. I don't say it judgmental. I just say it for real. I ask them, hey, man, what do you really want to do? I don't get the sense that playing professional baseball or making it to the major leagues is really that important to you. And sometimes that's enough to shake them and say, oh, yeah, it is. And you know what? As men, we have a hard time opening up, period. And we don't want to admit that we're afraid of anything. We don't want to admit that we don't know what we don't know. And so we created this culture of fake it until you make it, which I hate it. I hate that analogy. And I tell them, man, you're just faking it till you fail. Because if you don't intellectually understand something, you're not going to go compete against the best players in the world and it magically appear one day. And so we got it. So we can have all the physical skills and talents in the world. But the truth of it is, Geoff, these guys that really get it, these guys in the big leagues that dominate, that not only do they know what their physical capabilities are, they know what their limitations are. So when they're throwing pitches within their capability and their limitations, because that is what the brain trusts. That is what we can master. And that's something that becomes repeatable. Now it's a matter of when do I throw that pitch by velocity and movement to a specific location. And so if I was a pro scout or if I was running a pro organization, the physical capabilities is the easiest piece to see. And then, believe it or not, it's the easiest piece to teach. The hardest piece to honestly evaluate is whether this guy is really intellectually interested. Because if he is, when he gets in that pro ball environment, in the minor league environment, and as much as they try to sell it that it's a team, no, it isn't. They release guys every day out of that organization because they can't play. Has nothing to do with what kind of teammate they were. Now, is that being a good teammate something that they should strive for? Yes. But if you want to pitch in the big leagues one day, you better be pretty good at getting hitters out too. And so that's the shift that has to happen in that. But when we're working with guys that are really, they don't know whether they want to play baseball or not, that's okay, man. I'm not mad at them. I just want them to understand that if you want to be committed to the pro baseball, which is where most of my guys work, if you're going to be committed to that, then you got to understand that when you suck, people get fired, and at the same time, you could get fired too. And so we got to emotionally get past that, so we can really get into what I call the strategic piece, because there's a strategic gap, I call it. We focus so much on the scout skills, what it takes to get drafted, what it takes to get the scout's attention, what it takes to get the attention of the major league manager and GM. And we forgot about how do we individualize how these guys honestly pitch. And it's not these guys' fault, man. It's not these players' fault, because from the time they were 12 or 13, we've been ingrained it in their head through showcases and select ball and all this other stuff that, hey, if you ain't doing this, you're not going to get noticed. If you ain't doing this, if you don't throw this hard, you're not going to get noticed. And we de-emphasize actually getting hitters out. And then we get these kids drafted, or we get these kids that show up at some big time college programs. And I don't care what program it is, you can go in bullpens at the best schools, and there's a bunch of 90-mile-an-hour arms down there, and they're in that bullpen because they can't get hitters out. Has absolutely nothing to do with physical ability. And so I think what's happened now is every time a kid's struggling that throws 93, 94 miles an hour, everybody just takes their hands off of him, because they know it truly isn't a mechanical issue. Because how we choose our pitches isn't a mechanical issue. It's not a kinetic issue. How we choose our pitches is going to be based on past experience with this hitter and what they literally are thinking while they're standing on the rubber and the catcher puts the sign down. And that's what we got to grow these guys into, man. That's the piece that I think is missing. And it's not this woo-woo psychological motivation, jack them up kind of stuff. It's really just about, do they intellectually understand how they do what they do, and do they intellectually prepare for the other team's hitters based on the patterns and tendencies and the habits and the things that we see? And then can we correlate them two together? Can we sync that information together to create a game day strategy based on the pitches that this kid has mastered? And that's what I try to do with these guys. I try to get them to master their pitches, teach them how to read and study hitters. Again, man, this is not rocket science, but when you got a sense of what that hitter is looking for, and then you can exploit that with your pitches, now we have the chess match of pitching that we love. Now we're pitching. Now it's the playoffs. That's the kind of stuff, and I love it that way.
Receive a Baseball Awakening decal by subscribing on iTunes and leaving an objective review. To claim your decals, screenshot the review and email it to Geoff at baseballawakening.com. That's Geoff at baseballawakening.com, and we'll get that your way.
Yeah, so how do we make this shift?
I think there's guys out there. I think there's major league teams that's starting to get it. I'm starting to see it on their questionnaires that they're giving the players. You're starting to see them ask better questions, and some of it is that, and I do it. I got guys that I prep for these interviews, and I know agents are prepping their guys for the interviews. But what we got to get to is the business of minor league baseball is a numbers game. The percentage of kids that get drafted to get to the big leagues is very little. It's maybe 10%. So 90% of these kids that got the physical capability, or at least had enough capability to sign a pro contract, most of them are never getting out of A ball. And some of that is a numbers game. But most of that is because they don't get hitters out. It has very little to do with their physical capability. It has to do with the fact that they're playing 140 games a year. They're getting 20, 30, 40 times the opportunity, chance to pitch. And during them times, the team just ain't seeing what they need to see to keep them in the organization. That's the reality of the baseball side of it. Now, the opposite of this is the change is going to happen when coaches decide that I'm going to have better relationships with my kids, and I'm not going to force a training or a mechanical philosophy down this kid's throat. I'm going to let him instinctively, physically develop. And that don't mean we don't do strength conditioning or throwing programs or that. But what we're not going to do is force kids into an unnatural movement pattern at an early age. I honestly believe that's the number one reason why we have so many youth pitchers hurt, is because they show a little bit of athletic ability, and then we put them in with this coach who thinks that every pitcher ought to throw like this. And maybe that's not that kid's natural arm slot at 12 or 13 years old, but we sit here and we take him to pitching lessons 2 or 3 times a week that force him into an arm slot that's not instinctive or natural. And so now we're putting all kinds of force on this kid's arm and shoulder before he's probably at lower half strong enough to stabilize. And so now we're just like pouring gas on a fire. And so really at the younger age, man, I want guys to be instinctive. And then once they start getting into high school and we see them growing and maturing into, getting closer to the man they're going to be, then we can start adding some really specific stuff that we see. And there's some good coaches out there that's got that capability of doing these biomechanical assessments, doing these stuff. I'm all for that. But I think if we start that at 13 or 14 years old, before these kids even really get to puberty or get to a point, and then we force them into an unnatural movement pattern at any way, whether it's a lower half movement pattern or whether it's a upper half movement pattern, then I think we're creating the foundation for an injury. And so once we get past that piece of it, I think there's some good voices out there that's trying to explain that. But I think the business of youth baseball and the marketing in youth baseball has conditioned parents and these kids that if they can't throw 90 miles an hour by the time they're 14, 15, 16 years old, then they're not going to a D1 school or they're not going to get drafted. And part of that might be true, but also part of that is the reason we have a problem. It's because now we're forcing kids to go ahead and try things that don't feel natural or instinctive to them, or they don't even honestly trust or believe it. And so that's the piece when I start talking about the intellectual interest. I start talking about what is their personal desire and what's their emotional connection to it. If those 3 things ain't in place, when they get into high school and we start making it about something that don't feel instinctive or natural to them, then they're going to quit. They're going to walk away. And that's where we lose a lot of guys, man. And it has nothing to do with baseball itself. It has to do with how we make these kids feel. What kind of position we put them in. And it's not some woo-woo crybaby macho crap. It's the truth, Geoff. It's the way we make them feel, how we make them think what we make them think baseball is going to be like. And if it's going to be this miserable, unnatural, forced thing, then why would I ever want to go to college and do it for 4 more years and under a different level of pressure?
Right. So what do we say to the guy that says this arm slot is exactly the reason why you're not throwing strikes? Well,
again, I don't think arm slot is ever why they're not throwing strikes. I think there's times that we're asking kids to do things that they're not capable of doing yet. And a lot of that might be strength and conditioning. Some of it is because they're not thinking the right things when they're standing on the rubber. They don't understand how to grip, wrist, and forearm angle. They don't understand the release point. They don't understand these stuffs that we should be training. And that's what we want to do. But we want it to be natural and instinctive. Every kid's got different sized hands. Every kid's got different sized arms and legs and strength. And so when we sit here and put a cookie cutter program in place and we run all these different types of kids through it, some of them are going to be more instinctive into that style and going to be successful. But there's going to be this other group of kids that are just as talented as they are, but that program is not the right fit for them. And so we make them feel like that they suck or they ain't any good because they can't fit into our philosophy instead of the other way around. Hey, let's find some other way. Let's adapt to something different. and really turn it into, instead of it being you being systematic into my philosophy, let's turn it into how do we get hitters out, man. That's why you see so many of these coaches and these old timers talking about the playground. They just wish that summer ball was like it was back on the playground again, or the way it was in the sandlot when they were young. And the reason that is, Jeff, is because there wasn't no judgment going on. It was just winning and losing. They just played. They just went out there and played. And there's that emotional aspect of just going out there and playing, because you know what happened? When you're playing against your buddies every day, you learn their patterns and tendencies. You learn the things that they could hit and they couldn't hit. And then the next day, you see that they made an adjustment. And if they made an adjustment, you tried something different. See, that's the natural instinct that I want these pitchers to have. That if the hitter does something different, they see it, they react, and they do something that they're capable of doing, whether it's changing location or whether it's doing anything within that concept. And I think if you do that, then the mindset-wise, I think we kind of give these kids permission to be themselves. And until we can recreate that, Jeff, inside of either the academy setting or inside of the select ball setting or inside of high school, and coaches give these kids permission to be great athletes and do the things they do, but also give them permission to be themselves, then I think that's going to be the piece that kind of turns this around mindset-wise. Because a lot of these kids are a lot more physically talented than I was when I got drafted out of high school. But mindset-wise, man, they're so stuck in that convince and compare mindset that they feel like they got to convince everybody they meet that they're physically capable of playing. And then they're in this constant state of comparison against everybody else that they see, or every showcase they go to, or every tryout they go to. And honestly, it just emotionally wears them out. And if they think they're the best player, then they don't have no problem. But the second that they see two or three other kids that throw harder than them, and that's what all their confidence, the source of their confidence comes from their velocity. And now all of a sudden they go to the showcase and two or three kids throw harder than them, they feel like they suck and they ain't no good anymore.
Yeah, that's a big problem at every level. The whole comparing part, hell, I did it whenever I played.
Nope. Yeah.
And I think most guys do. So how do we start working on the process? Because naturally we're gonna run into someone who we perceive to be much better than us, and then we have kind of the self-doubt. So how do we reframe the mind of a player to say, hey, don't worry about them, just do you?
Yeah, I think there's parts of it that we got to make sure that when we sit here and start evaluating these young players, we got to be careful about what kind of measurements we're honestly using. And I know nobody wants to hear that, because now summer ball and select ball and all this stuff is a business. And it really is. It almost mimics the minor leagues in the way that they approach it and the stuff they do, except for these parents are paying a lot of money to go play. And again, I'm not knocking it either way. That's a decision that parents need to make. But the reality of it is that when we put them in that environment at 12, 13, 14 years old, and we sell that as that this is how you get recognized, this is how you get noticed, this is how you get respect from college coaches and pro scouts. And we start selling that to coaches and kids and to parents, and we do that, and we're a part of that system, then we got to realize there's a psychological effect that happens on 12, 13, 14-year-old kids that ain't ready emotionally for that. They're still playing because they want to hang out with their friends. They're still playing because they love it. And most of the stuff that's above and beyond that is based on the fact that these kids now are being judged just like we're judging kids at pro tryouts, just like we're judging kids in spring training, and we're deciding who's going to make the teams and who ain't, who's getting cut and going home today. And so we're taking that kind of emotional consequence and putting it on 12, 13, 14-year-old kids, and the same emotional consequence that we put on 22, 23, 24-year-old men. Some of them are 30-year-old men, and still hate that feeling, that thought of not being good enough and getting rejected. And so, again, man, we can sit here and talk about failure. We can talk about all kinds of stuff, but there's a huge difference in trying something that didn't work than trying something that makes you feel like a failure and being judged to this extent that you don't even want to try no more. And so we got to get past this macho crap, man, that's just not real. And again, is there a physical component to pitching? Absolutely. Do I love guys that can throw 94, 95? You bet, man. That is an awesome tool to have when you're standing on the rubber deciding what pitch to throw. But if you don't know how to use that velocity, it's useless. And sometimes, Jeff, I have guys that tell me they wish they never even had that velocity, because now the expectations from the fans and the scouts and the team and the parents is so great. And honestly, intellectually and emotionally, these kids have no idea really how to use it as a pitcher. And so, man, I know that's kind of deep, and people don't always like hearing it, but it's the truth, man. It's the reality.
It is, and we've talked about that. And there is this is the missing link, and we've got to figure out how to help more kids, be where they want to be. So Darrell, let me ask you. You know, you got a guy who is intellectually, personal, and emotionally interested. He's in, and you know he's in, but he can't get guys out. So what now? What do we do to get this guy to understand himself and understand what he has to do to get guys out?
Great question. I want him to think strategically. Everything we do from this point then is strategic. I want him to understand his capabilities and limitations. So the first thing I try to do with these guys is put them in a mastery mode. What pitches do they throw? What pitches can they consistently, by a specific velocity range and a specific movement pattern, execute to a certain location? So what that lets us do is know that we got 2 or 3 pitches that we can honestly trust. Every pitch that we have, man, is just a pitch that's by velocity and movement to a location. And when we can consistently locate those pitches on purpose, now we can move into a strategic mindset. So now it's not a matter of when I'm standing on that rubber, whether I can physically throw this pitch or not. Now it's a matter of what do I know about that hitter? And then is this the best pitch by velocity of movement to this location to throw right there in that count? And so what we do is we sit here and we identify 2 or 3 pitches that they trust, and they know that they have the physical capability to throw it. So what I want them to do then is go into what I call mastery mode or into strategic bullpens. Now we take those pitches and we fine tune the release point just to move location. That's it. I want everything to be off of their fastball movement pattern. And then we have just a different grip, wrist, and forearm angle and grip pressure and release point for our pitches. And so that way, that first 20 feet is coming out of their hand, the tunneling or all this stuff that these guys talk about. The hitter has to make a decision that first 20 feet, and we're not showing anything. I think you've seen it in the playoffs this year, man. Pitchers tip pitches all the time. So one thing that we want is not just consistency, which is what I think a lot of these trainers do with these mechanics and all this other stuff. We're trying to create this repeatable mechanics that's not habitual or patternized to the point that a hitter can sit and find some cues and clues of what this pitcher is about to throw. And so when we identify that piece of it, now, Jeff, honestly, we can throw mastery bullpens, which means that we track our bullpens by velocity and movement to a location. And now the next step in the strategic process is learning how to read and study hitters. And so it's more than just the data. You know what? I want them to see how guys react in every count, man. What do they do? First pitch, second pitch, third pitch. What do they do? 0-1, 0-2. What do they do in positive counts, negative counts? What do they do second time through the order, third time through the order? Every one of us as human beings has got patterns and habits and tendencies that we have. And so all I really want these guys to do is become more sensitive to noticing it, especially when they're not pitching. And so when they're watching the other team, even in BP or anywhere else, you can see habits and patterns and tendencies when you see guys do things a certain way, a certain time, certain plays. If they get a hit the first at bat, what do they do the second at bat? If they swung at the first pitch, the first bat, what do they do the second at bat? And I know it seems almost overwhelming with the information, but what that lets us do is when we start watching games, we watch hitters differently. We're not watching it for that. We're not watching it for the outcome. We're watching, honestly, what that hitter's preparing, what he's thinking in the box, and we're seeing it in how he responds. And I think that's what you see the best pitchers in the world do, man. I call it situational count awareness. They know what pitches they have mastered. And now they go study these hitters the best they can. They take the data from the data guys. They take the information from the baseball guys. And then they see the habits and patterns and tendencies that the catcher sees. And they all take all this information, and it comes into part of the decision-making process when they're standing on the rubber deciding what pitch to throw. That's the information that I want to round up and get these guys thinking about. And that's where the strategic piece comes in. Go ahead.
I'm Geoff Rottmayer, and thank you for listening to our conversation on the Baseball Awakening podcast. Stay tuned for part 2 of our conversation with Darrel Coulter tomorrow.